So we have now spent a great deal of time creating our rubrics with all of our criterion and proficiency levels and all the details of that rubric. We have tested it with a few sample assignments, and now we are finally ready to grade a stack of assignments, or however the student submissions are submitted to you, with our rubric. And so we want to go through the process of how to grade with a rubric. And one of the main advantages now to you as a teacher for the rubric is that all that work that you did creating the rubric in such detail will pay off in that grading is much easier for this assignment now. So to begin the grading process, this is best case scenario here. We want to make sure that we have a good working knowledge of the assignment and the rubric. So the grading process of student submissions really requires a teacher to have a very intimate and thorough knowledge of both the assignment, including all the details of these student instructions, and really looking at those instructions from a student's perspective, and are there holes in those instructions or anything like that, as well as the rubric being used to compare the student work with the descriptors within the rubric. And so again, the best case scenario here would be, you're a veteran teacher, you have assigned this assignment or a similar assignment, for a number of years possibly, something very similar, and you have created a rubric now to make it more specific to students, what you're looking for in terms of expectations for this assignment, and to make it easier to grade for you. Or maybe this assignment you've switched it up a little bit with some of what we've talked about in the course, of making it to where it's your student's choice now of exactly what they submit to show you how much they have learned about this particular topic. So maybe now, instead of it just being a paper, now you're accepting videos and presentations and online posters and, whatever, Canva infographics or whatever it might be. So maybe that's the change that you've made. So the more intimate you are with the assignment and the instructions, as well as the rubric, the grading process is just going to be that much easier. And so those are some goals. If you're a first-year teacher, then an assumption on my part might be that you created this assignment, or at least you got it from somewhere, Pinterest, your textbook, wherever it might be, but you are knowledgeable enough about it that you chose it for a very specific reason. You like the assignment, you think it will be good for your students, and then I'm going to assume that you wrote a rubric for this assignment, and so you are intimately acquainted with that rubric since you wrote it. And again, those things will be critical to make the grading process much easier for you for this assignment and student submissions for this assignment. So it requires a laser focus while you're grading. This can be tough, but it requires that laser focus to be looking for very specific things as you're grading this. And so you need to be looking for the evidence within each student's submission for every item within the rubric. So as you are reading their submissions, observing their presentations, hearing their video content, watching their video content, perhaps tasting, all this depends on how they are submitting this particular assignment to you. Maybe you teach foreign language and you have them create things in class that are foods of that culture or whatever. If they still exist, sewing teacher, and you're feeling the fabric of the particular object that they made, whatever it might be. So reading, observing, hearing, watching, tasting, feeling, participating in, or using each student's submission, you need to be laser focused on looking for the evidence within that experience of how they're demonstrating their learning to you for each item within the rubric. Focused on those things because you're so intimately knowledgeable of the rubric and and the performance levels within that rubric. So you are looking for matches with your laser focus. You are using this process, and it may require multiple passes or opportunities to go through the rubric in order to focus on each criterion independently. Just depends on how complex the assignment is or how complex the presentation method is, or the submission method. If it is a live presentation, that might be a little bit harder to do multiple passes, because once the presentation is over, unless you're going to ask them to present again, which is doubtful, you need to be able to do this semi-quickly, or be able to, again, be so intimately knowledgeable of the rubric, you can be looking for those things mentally as they are presenting the one time they are going to present this. As you observe that student work, however they're submitting it, the goal is to match the content of their performance as close as possible to the descriptor in a specific performance level in your rubric for each of those criterion that you have included in that rubric. That's what you're looking for as you go through and grade a particular submission. So this is where the quality of your descriptors is key to this process. The better, this is not going to be great English, I guess, but the better you wrote those descriptors, the easier this process is going to be, and the more specific you can be with your grading. And again, if your students see your rubric beforehand, the more specific they can be in knowing what you're expecting from their submission. Once you match up one of the criterion, so typically, may not always be this way, but typically the first criterion, you're looking for that as they are, as you are reading or viewing or participating in or whatever their submission. You're looking for that first one, and you're looking for where does their presentation or performance meet the performance level within that criterion. And then you just work your way through the rubric and looking for each of the criterion that you have created within your rubric. Again, this is why the knowledge of the rubric and the laser focus come into play. The more you are familiar with your rubric and what you're going to be looking for, the more focused you can be on finding that within, or the lack of it, within each student's submission. Point values. So we worked hard, right, at coming up with an overall point value for this assignment, breaking that up into each criterion and so on. And so the overall process here, though, is to determine a point-based grade for each student's submission, right? You put all that work into determining those point values, and the whole point is to be able to come up with a point-based grade now for their assignment. And so because you did all that, adding those up and so on for each criterion makes the grading process much easier. So what was our overall goal here? Again, the most common concept of grading within a rubric is to come up with a total point value by adding up the points earned in each of the criteria, and that this is the student's overall grade, right? That was our goal with our rubric, is to be able to give an accurate and clear grading process with lots of feedback to our students for each assignment that they submit. Remember, one of the main reasons in using rubric is to provide that good feedback. So if you have built your rubric well, if you have those good descriptors in there, then that already is providing good feedback. But of course, there is the option of adding even more specific feedback if you choose to. I will emphasize that again. One of the main reasons that we're using rubrics is to provide good feedback to your students. And so if your students aren't reviewing their rubrics after here you spend all this time to fill out their rubric, while you're grading their submission, you need to provide, if possible, class time for them to go through and specifically look at the rubric. And maybe at the beginning of the year, or whenever you start using rubrics with your students, maybe the first couple, you go through the process, you hand out all their assignment submissions, maybe, of whatever it might be. You hand out their grades in the form of a copy of the rubric for them to see, their copy of the rubric, with their feedback in it and so on. And then you have a blank rubric at the front of the class. And maybe this first couple assignments that you use rubrics for, you go through the whole rubric with them so that each one of them can review their personal rubric for their assignment and see exactly how to review a rubric when they get them back in the future. They can see where their grade comes from, they can see your feedback on that rubric, and they can learn the process of using rubrics to learn from, to do better next time. In particular for assignments that are very similar to each other, but also just in general for the rubric process in your classroom. Again, coming back to that feedback concept, this feedback can be in various forms. If you happen to be using the Canvas learning management system at your school, they'll be able to see their personal rubric right in there, the one that you graded within Canvas. And I do have a separate video, or a separate page, right after this, with a couple videos in it that is specific to Canvas if you happen to be fortunate enough to be in a school that uses Canvas, because it's a great LMS for using rubrics with. So, but if you're doing this with pencil and paper, then it's my high recommendation to make photocopies of your rubric, and you can do this electronically too. The examples I'm going to show you here I did electronically because I did it for an online class that I was teaching, and so you can do the same concept in electronic format, but I'm just doing the example of pencil and paper. I would recommend making photocopies of your rubric, circle each descriptor as you are grading. So the grading process here that we're still talking about would include having a copy of the rubric for that particular student that you are grading their submission. On that copy of the rubric, you would circle each descriptor cell within your rubric that applies, that matches up that criterion, or that performance level, for that criterion for that particular student submission. So you're circling each cell that applies to that particular student submission, and then you can include some customized feedback either at the side of each row, each criterion, or at the bottom of the rubric, or whatever fits for you. Okay? So let me show you an example of what I mean. So here's our first example. This was for a class that I taught on, I think I've used this example before, math for elementary school teachers. And so this was a weekly lesson activity that they had to do, and this was the grading rubric for it. And so what I want you to notice here is that it really doesn't matter the content of the rubric and that kind of thing. I want you to look for all the light blue, red, and green. All that is feedback for an individual student here. So again, I did this electronically because I was teaching this online, but you could do this with pencil and paper. And so I made the red circles. I happen to be a Mac user. And in Preview, it's an Apple product that comes with every computer. In Preview, you can do this relatively easily. Possibly you could do this in Word. Might be a little bit more challenging, but I can create these red circles around each cell that applied to this particular student's submission. I have that one big oval there for the third criterion because it was kind of in between those two, between excellent and acceptable, I have a blue box up at the top that provides a little bit of an explanation of why they got their score. This particular student happened to be late. The little blue boxes, light blue boxes for each criterion, has a little bit of feedback for that particular criterion and that particular performance level. And in the very bottom, in that green box, I have overall feedback to them. And so there's the feedback from the circles, there's the feedback for each individual performance level, and the overall feedback, all inside of their rubric that they're going to get back from me. Here's a second example. Same class, actually. This is their final assignment. And so just another example, but I was just showing it because it's a longer rubric. Again, still lots of feedback that I gave within each criterion and performance level, score at the top added up for them, overall feedback at the bottom. So just a couple of examples there of how you could do this pencil and paper electronically to give them that feedback within their rubric so that they know exactly why they got the score that they did and not just the score, but how well they did. And so that first example was a weekly assignment. And so for them to get that feedback, especially like week 1, week 2, week 3 of the class, that was critical for them to be able to keep building and getting better in their submissions for that. This was the final assignment in the course, and so, but the feedback was still important to them. So, what will you notice as you begin grading using your rubric? You'll be much more focused on the pieces of the assignment that are most important, because that's why you built your rubric. You built your rubric with those criterion because those are the things that you felt were most critical for them learning the objective of the assignment or the objective of the topic of your course. You will be able to provide very specific feedback to your students when grading by way of a detailed performance level description, like in those examples that we just looked at, and that you've created within the rubric. And then your students will be able to build on their earlier attempts at similar types of assignments as you progress. Again, especially if you can use a little bit of a process of how to review their rubrics that you give back to them once an assignment is scored. You can provide specific comments for individual criterion on your rubric beyond the descriptor, like I did in those light blue boxes, or for the assignment as a whole, like I did with the green box at the bottom on those examples. You can do all of this process relatively quickly, really. That's the whole main advantage to teachers for using rubrics, is that you can provide this feedback relatively quickly. And honestly, it just depends on the level of assignment that this is. If this is a very quick, weekly, quick writing assignment or whatever, maybe the just circling each cell on the rubric is enough feedback for them to grow on for next week. And so it's up to you, depending on the assignment, the weight of the assignment and your overall grading scale and all that, how much feedback you provide beyond just the circling of the cells, because again, that is feedback in and of itself. Therefore, you can grade a set of class assignments pretty quickly while also providing very specific and well-described feedback to your students. That's the kind of the win-win. There's more wins than this because of the providing the rubric beforehand to where students know what your expectations are. There's other wins, but this is the big win for each of you. They get better feedback. It's easier for you to grade the assignment and look for very specific things. You don't get sidetracked on how pretty their submission is or how detailed they got maybe in something, if that's not necessarily what the objective of the assignment was, and so on. Okay? And we're done, except for just one detail that your book brought up, the textbook that we're using. And so I just wanted to cover it real quick. I would say most people will not do this, but I just want to cover it just so you see how it could be used. So the most common concept of grading within a rubric is to come up with a total point value by simply adding up all the points earned in the criteria and performance levels for that student's overall grade on the assignment. That's the normal, typical way of doing it. The examples that I'm going to show for you are a little bit more complicated, but you may choose to use it depending on the assignment. So this is not the only way to do it. So the book talked about mean, median, and mode. Another method to summarize an assignment into one overall grade is to use the median or mode, and I'll tell you why I'm just looking at those two, of the scores for each of your criterion. These are the three typical ways, mean, median, mode, of combining more than one score into an average score, right? These are the basic statistical methods of average is a general term here, but kind of an average score for multiple grading concepts here. So here's the example from the book, how to summarize mean, median, and mode. So an example is calculating all three of these within this table, figure 11.1 in your book. Shows an example of a student submission that was scored on a 6-point rubric with 4 different criteria. Okay, and the example that they gave this particular student scored 6, 5, 3, and 3 on those separate criterion. Okay? All 4 criteria were of equal weight. So if they were not, then, if the first one was worth whatever, 25% of the grade and so on, then you would have to multiply the weights in order to come up with this averaging process. That would just be another thing that would kind of make the scoring even more complex if each criterion were not worth the same. But if they're not, and most of my rubrics are not, then you would need to do a multiplication factor here. But this figure shows the different ways of calculating it. And so the mean one there, basically the second row of the table, shows that you just add up all the scores and divide by 4 because there's 4 of them, right? So their grade would be 4.25. Well, okay. 6, 5, 3, and 3. Mean 4.25. Okay. The median, again, to calculate the median, you line them up in order, and you go 6, 5, 3, 3. And the median would be the middle score. Well, since there were 4 items, there is no middle score. And so it would be that mean or average of the 2 middle ones. So in this case, their score would be 4. The mode is the one that happens the most often, right? The score that shows up the most often. Well, that may not be a great way to base their... I think a student would be upset if they got a 3 on a rubric where they scored 6 and 5 on 2 of the items. And so that may not be the best way. So as you look at this example, our author recommends the median because it is less prone to be statistically pulled by extreme scores in one criterion, like the mean might be, or certainly the mode in our example here is. And so I'm just throwing that out as an example. Might be another way to grade things besides just adding up the points within each of the performance levels. Just another example of grading is all. I'm going to come back to this slide. Easier grading with better feedback. This was the whole reason, one of the main reasons, I shouldn't say the whole reason, but a big portion of the reason to use rubrics. You can grade a class set of assignments pretty quickly, especially, again, if you happen to use Canvas, but even on pencil and paper. I did mine relatively quickly with that whole circling and providing feedback electronically. And so you can do that while also providing very specific, detailed feedback, well-described feedback to your students in multiple ways. And so they grow. This is the concept of using rubrics to learn, to develop learning within your students. And so all of this comes together here with your grading process. And I'll be honest with you, it feels good when you have a good rubric and you can provide this good feedback to your students. You see such growth in their submissions as time progresses. So that's the process of grading with rubric. Does it require experience? Absolutely. The more experience you have of grading with rubrics and the better you get at this process as you begin to use them and experience the process, you will get better and better at grading things, and your students will get better and better at understanding how to use those rubrics to learn better, to create better submissions for your assignments, and to grow with you throughout the rest of your course.